Welcome to another episode of Systems Philosophy. Today's episode will follow on from the themes I have been constructing over the previous 4 episodes, beginning with the concept that a form or a structure can be considered an object independent of the atoms and the matter, since the atoms and the matter can be exchanged but the form persists. This is the ship of Theseus example. I have described this as a related information structure, an information field if you like, and over time the information field is maintained. It's acted upon by 2 forces that try and keep it repaired, save the integrity, keep it coherent, and forces that try to dissipate or destroy it, let it die. Order versus chaos, if you like, in the most fundamental sense. A good perspective from which to understand the dynamics of these information structures is cybernetics and systems theory, cybernetics being computing and information science, which is one of the reasons that I chose the name of my channel as Systems Philosophy. We have used examples from life and living systems, including technology maintained by people, and we are living systems, because they are the most mysterious and in many ways the most interesting examples where the dynamics of the systems that I'm describing play out, and evolution is the original field, the original playground, if you like. Evolution has twin problems. It needs to maintain the integrity of the system, and we've been using the living cell because it was the first, in terms of our theory at least, self-sustaining living organism. And the living cell wishes to maintain its form and stay alive in the face of perturbances. That is counterbalanced with the need of the living cell to adapt, evolve and change. So as a corollary to the order and chaos of the external world, we have the living systems needing to develop dynamics that are not too stable and also not too unstable. They need to live in the sweet spot, and the sweet spot itself can be an evolved characteristic. Some organisms choose to change quickly and reproduce with a lot of variability. The cell is one example. The single cell, in some cases, can double every 4 hours or so, which leads to huge exponential population growth in favourable conditions. If those conditions change, we can also have huge die-offs. That is, if we view the cell as a system undergoing an evolutionary search algorithm in the space of reality on the biosphere of this planet. That is the brute force method, where the system simply generates so many individuals that the adaptation chances are increased by sheer weight of numbers. Somewhere one of the bacteria will have a random mutation that will let it survive, and that will then lead to a specific niche where the system and the search specializes, and the same exponential dynamics start again. So from a search algorithm perspective, as the fitness approaches a maximum, the chances of the bacteria's survival increase, and therefore more of that particular type of bacteria will rise in the population. We can see the fitness landscape of the biosphere, of the surface of the earth where life can survive, as having peaks and troughs. Peaks are places where life is easy for certain variants. Troughs are places where life is not so easy. And just like traversing from one mountain peak to another, a bacteria might specialize for one peak, while a related strain has climbed the different path up a different peak, and so we get specialization. One may be sulfur reducing, one may be methane reducing, for instance, in the archaeobacteria. So we have the multi-peak landscape of the evolutionary playing field, and we get divergence of form and function to climb the various peaks. This is still pretty much within the first 4 sessions in terms of what we've talked about and explored. Today I wish to talk about the concept of, I've just got a fisherman turned up on the beach. Anyway, the concept of modularity, because in trying to stay adaptable, the more complex the organism gets, the more brittle and more cost has to be paid for adaptation. You become highly specialized, and like the ship of Theseus, the form of the ship starts to lock your function, and without starting from scratch, which living organisms cannot do, morphing from one form to another becomes very difficult. And so what these systems in dynamic equilibrium as entropy increasing dissipative structures that maintain their own form achieve is that evolution selects modularity so that you can maintain the overall structure but swap out components. The ship of Theseus is an example. We have modular components which include masts and sails and ropes and planks. The components combine to build the entire ship, but you can replace a plank without having to replace the ship. In living systems, the original modular component is the gene within the DNA. And so we get the language of DNA through the basic chemistry of the amino acids, which themselves is a modular system. We then get individual genes, which can encode for proteins, which is a modular system. And then we get collections of genes, which can encode for inheritable characteristics. Within multicellular organisms, these are the chromosomes, but within single cell organisms, and forgive me, I've forgotten the name, but they're loop ring structures of DNA that can be picked up from the environment and exchanged with the environment. Software development has independently discovered the same need for modularity. Originally, when programming started, and even now, you can freeform code any application in something that was considered spaghetti code, because instead of having structured loops and functions, you essentially just code the application with logic paths that jump from anywhere to anywhere, and you can develop an effective and functional application that then becomes a nightmare for any computer programmer to maintain. The answer, as program complexity has increased, is modularity. We modularize the language functions themselves. The original computer code was written directly for the hardware capabilities of the processor in something called machine language. We then discovered that it was far more useful to abstract the software from the hardware, because hardware generations turned over a lot faster than software generations. And so the first generation abstracted languages were born. Things like BASIC, COBOL, Fortran, which used compilers to translate instructions into machine language. It also freed people from the tedium of writing machine language, which is very detailed and quite difficult to keep control of as your project size increases. So technology, like biology, undergoes the same dynamic systems forces of evolution. And over the course of these episodes, I will make the links explicitly. For the moment, I'm just pointing out that information systems have developed modularity, and within that modularity, the languages themselves had functions, much like living organisms have genes. The genes encode proteins that can do certain physical work within the nanomachinery of the cell. But the protein structures themselves, like the functions, can be adapted to different circumstances. What this does is it allows greater flexibility in form and function of the organism without the brittleness of having to evolve the entire structure. It also makes the search space more tractable, because you have a hierarchically nested modular form. Again, going back to computer code, you have the functions within the programming language which do certain things. You can then build your own functions and modules which combine in a structured way to create a project, a selection of code which becomes the entire system. And these systems are very complex today. Take something like Microsoft Office or Adobe Acrobat. It's a huge complex system which is broken down into individual applications. Those applications then have individual functions which the user can call through menus, and those functions themselves are code modules which might rely on function libraries from within the language set or the operating system code set. So we have nested complexity, which allows the higher levels of complexity to be modified and maintained at a far lower cost than constructing everything from the ground up with machine code. The same goes for biology. We have genetics, genes and groups of genes that encode for proteins that then operate at the level of the cell. Cells can form related structures where they combine into colonies. Those colonies can form things like lichen or bacterial mats, which include different microbes. Things like stromatolites were multicellular structures that didn't include sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction abstracted the modular exchange of chromosomes within single cells, and those single cells separated the chromosomes into two sexes and built different bodies from those separated chromosome collections, and then tested those bodies for survival against reality and reproduction, of course. This is the multicellular form of life and death that we're familiar with. We can also consider that a species is a search space that has been modularized by reproduction. So we have a collection of individuals that is exploring a fitness landscape, just like an individual microbe might explore a fitness landscape. But now that collection is restricted by its gene pool, but the higher level functional variation is also enabled by that gene pool. So instead of having to rely on individual gene mutation, every sexual reproduction event introduces a chromosome shuffle, which hugely enhances the search space and also allows for individual characteristics to be tested in multivariable fitness tests. I believe that humanity has 23 pairs, 46 chromosomes. So every being is testing 23 unique combinations of chromosomes over a lifetime for survival and reproduction. The individuals that reproduce will then mix those chromosomes randomly, 50% chance of passing on one of yours with your partner into the next generation. This is very similar from an abstracted point of view to a search algorithm. And Richard Dawkins explored this concept in his work on the selfish gene, which looked at genetic selection from the point of view of genes instead of organisms. Okay, so I've taken the concept that we started with on the first 4 episodes, and I've now emphasized the genetic search algorithm that is part of the overall living form that tests its fitness against reality. The process that has been working in reflexive modification of both itself and the Earth's environment for around 3.5 billion years. Reflexivity means that as the organism evolves, it feeds back into the environment and alters its own fitness landscape. And in that way, we imagine these hills and peaks that the genetic fitness algorithm is climbing, but in reality, these peaks are moving targets. The reflexivity ensures that as you climb the peak changes underneath you and morphs to the point where you still need to respond. This in cybernetics is known as the Red Queen problem. You need to keep running just to keep standing still. And that is a definition of dynamic equilibrium. Dynamic equilibrium has the opposing forces of order and chaos, and evolution needs to balance the two. If the organism becomes too ordered, too set in its ways, it becomes brittle, like glass or a crystal. It can't flex and adapt to change, and therefore is vulnerable to environmental disruption. Stable ecologies, which we'll get to in later episodes, form stable niches, and therefore the dynamic equilibrium can hold and even attract different organisms into a particular form in relation to other living forms within the ecology. We haven't gotten to that stage of inter-system interactions yet. What we have talked about today is the fact that both human technology in the form of ships, where we replace planks and masts instead of the whole ship, and especially in cybernetics and information systems, where the complexity has forced modularity. Otherwise, the systems are simply unmaintainable by the human mind. So the physical effort of maintenance is vastly reduced, and the ability to reuse previous structures and code is vastly improved. You can generate a new code function by starting with an old one and just slightly modifying it, just like you can generate a new protein by starting with an existing gene and slightly modifying it. The concept of modularity is real and very important. Modularity itself is nested hierarchically, just like life is nested hierarchically. We have single cells existing within multicellular organisms. The multicellular organisms are modules created by those single cells, and the modules are expressed as species and gene pools and individual organisms. These are all perspectives of the same sort of modular structure, and those modular structures exist within larger collections we call ecologies. That's enough for today. This is systems philosophy, and the sun is rising behind me on the Tasman Sea.